In the modern Western worldview, the afterlife is divided generally into two realms, heaven and hell. Heaven is where the good people go, and hell is where the bad people go. There are variations on this concept, but this is the general idea, especially in Christian circles. Heaven and hell are realms in which the soul resides permanently within this worldview, based on either their beliefs or actions within this life. It might surprise people to know that this was not necessarily the worldview of people in the first century, and this worldview is not what was taught in the New Testament. In fact, this really wasn't the worldview in the first century. Nor does this worldview necessarily align with the thousands of testimonies from near-death experiencers around the world. This worldview emerged largely out of the Middle Ages, and was heavily influenced by various theologians and writers until it emerged into the dichotomy we see today. In the Greek, there are three words which are traditionally translated as hell. Only one of them even might carry the traditional meaning, and this word is only used once. The first word we encounter in the Greek New Testament is Hades. In Greek, Hades. This is actually the name of the Greek Olympian god and ruler of the underworld. In the Greek worldview, the sky was ruled by Zeus, the seas were ruled by Poseidon, and the underworld was ruled by Hades. Over time, Hades' name became synonymous with the realm he ruled. The underworld was a realm with various different regions and geographical features, including several rivers such as the Styx and the Lethe. The three main regions of the underworld were the Elysian Fields, where the virtuous dead went, in which were also the Isles of the Blessed, where the most heroic, righteous, and virtuous would eventually find themselves. The Fields of Asphodel, where those who were not virtuous, but also not wholly evil, were consigned, and Tartaros, which incidentally is the only word in Greek which occurs in the New Testament that might correspond to the traditional concept of hell, and occurs once in 2 Peter 2:4. Tartarus is where monstrous souls who had committed grave offenses were consigned. This is described as the abyss, the pit where the monstrous titans who had castrated and murdered their father Uranos were chained forever. This word, Abaddon, is found in Revelation 23. That is 20 verse 3. It should be noted that in the New Testament, Tartaros and the abyss are described as prisons for those angels or spiritual beings who rebelled against God. They aren't described as prisons for human souls. The final word, which is traditionally translated as hell from the Greek, is Gehenna, or Gehenna. This word is a Hellenization of the Hebrew term Gehinnom. Most immediately, this referred to the Valley of Hinnom, which was at one time a place of child sacrifice to Molech, and then later a garbage dump, as well as a place where the corpses of criminals and unclaimed bodies were dumped. Fires were kept going to incinerate the refuse, and, as you can imagine, there were worms and maggots everywhere. That is the real world image given by this word. But in rabbinic literature in the first century, and even up to this day in Jewish thought, Gehenna took on a spiritual meaning. It came to mean a place for those souls who had sinned or committed wrongdoing in this life to undergo correction as a kind of purification before passing on into the presence of God. In a way, the meaning of Gehenna was more synonymous with the Catholic concept of purgatory than the modern concept of a permanent hell. In Jewish thought, a soul could only remain in Gehenna for up to 11 months, no matter what. After the 11 months, they were allowed to move on. Gehenna was not a pleasant place to be, but the key idea here is that it was not permanent, nor was it ever seen as permanent, not even in Jesus' time. Why then does the New Testament describe eternal punishment? Well, honestly, that depends on how you translate the words which are used in reference to this punishment. First, the word used in reference to punishment in the afterlife is always kolossis. This word doesn't mean vengeance or retribution. It means correction, checking the growth, or disciplinary action. Second, the word used, which is translated as eternal in reference to Colossus, is always aionios. There are two words which can be translated as eternal in Greek, but they have specifically different meanings. The first is aidios, which means forever, without end. This word is never applied to this disciplinary action in the afterlife in the New Testament. The second, as mentioned, is aionios, which is a little more nuanced. It doesn't actually mean without end. The meaning of aionios comes closer to the idea of outside of time or undefined time. The gods in Greek mythology existed aionios, but not necessarily aidios. Aionios as a concept reflects a realm where time has no meaning. It's ageless. It could be 5 minutes, it could be 1,000 years. It's a realm where all times are now and past, present, and future don't apply. So, the disciplinary action being described as taking place in this Gehenna, where the worm doesn't die and the fire isn't quenched, isn't being described as being forever, within a timeline, but taking place in a realm where time doesn't exist. And whether it's 5 minutes or 11 months is irrelevant, except with the understanding that it's not permanent. And while the end of it is undefined, there will be an end to it. Finally, among the many near-death experience testimonies are a number of what would be described as hellish experiences. These are much fewer than the heavenly encounters. Maybe 25% of the near-death experience testimonies include some kind of a hellish experience. But they do exist, and they always leave those who experience it profoundly shaken and changed. What is important to note as common among these negative NDEs is that the person always seems to find themselves in a dark, nearly pitch black pit-like region, where they can't see hardly anything at all. They're always in some kind of torment, either emotional or seemingly being able to feel pain. There's usually some kind of negative beings present, usually described as demons, ready and waiting to inflict more excruciating pain and injury on the person. And finally, there's no sense of time. It is almost always described as it could have been minutes, it could have been thousands of years. From what I have read and heard, most of the people who encounter this were self-admittedly incredibly selfish and self-serving going into it, and recognized that fact while they were experiencing it. They continuously reflected on how they lived their lives and the people they hurt, either by commission or omission. What is incredibly important to note here is that many, if not most, came to the point where they cried out to God from this hellish place, having realized their mistakes, and God responded, usually by sending someone, usually Jesus Christ himself, or an angel of some kind, to retrieve them from there, heal them from their hellish experience, and bring them into a paradisical realm, where they would then experience the full presence and love of God unfiltered. They would then go through a life review, experiencing both how they helped others and had hurt others from the perspective of the other person. Some then were given the choice of staying or returning. Others were directly told they were being sent back. Some may point out two specific passages which in English translations would seem to indicate that punishment is forever, and that those cast into the lake of fire will be tormented forever. These two passages are Matthew 25:41 and 46, and Revelation 20, verse 10. To sum up briefly, the first passage is the judgment of the sheep and the goats, that is, those who were kind and compassionate to the least of these, and those who weren't. In Matthew 25:41, it reads in the New American Bible Revised Edition translation, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" And in 25:46 it says, "And these will go off to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." As I wrote previously, the word used here for eternal is not aidios, but aionios, or one of its cognates, in both instances. That is, outside of time, but not forever. Secondly, the word for punishment is, also as previously mentioned, kolossis, which means disciplinary action or correction, and in particular, checking the growth of a plant. It does not mean vengeance or retribution. There are other words in Greek for that. In Revelation 20, verse 10, in the neighbor, it is very traditionally translated, "The devil who had led them astray was thrown into the pool of fire and sulfur where the beast and false prophet were. There they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." This sounds pretty straightforward until you realize that the word torment is a mistranslation in this context, as potentially is forever and ever. The word translated as torment is basanizo, and it actually means to investigate, put to the test, to examine closely, cross-question, or interrogate. It can also have the meaning of to question by torture, but the main concept of the word is the questioning, investigating, and examining, not the torture. The phrase in Greek translated as forever and ever is estus aionos ton aionon. Literally, it means into the ages of ages. This is an idiomatic way in Greek of expressing an undefined number of eons, that is, a very long but indeterminate period of time or even outside of time. It implies that the end point is not known, but there may or may not be an end point. It means that there is no certainty either way. When applied to the idea of Gehenna, or when taken with the testimonies of NDEers who have had hellish experiences, the understanding of these original Greek words and phrases only reinforces the idea that this torment or hellish experience is not meant to be permanent, and that release from it is not only possible, but intended once the person held within has come to their senses. It is undefined because that release is contingent on the person themselves coming to their senses and crying out to God. Anytime you see the word hell in a translation of the New Testament, it is rendering one of the words which I have just described, and the concepts which the original disciples and those who heard Jesus and first read the apostles' letters were not what the modern word hell evokes. In their minds, at the very least, it was a temporary disciplinary realm, meant to purify the person in error and bring them to their senses, much like the NDEers described from their own experiences. Those truly hellish realms like the abyss, Tartarus, were intended for monstrous, powerful, and dangerous spiritual beings to keep them prisoners so they couldn't harm anyone. They were never intended for human souls, pieces and shreds of the Logos, who is himself born from the God, which were always intended to return to the God from whom they were born.